Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton and this is a short story called Squared Up for the Meat Raffle. Well, that's it, Joe said, thumping the table with his badly tattooed knuckles. What is? His altogether less aggressive friend asked, while glancing nervously at the table. Glass broke easily. Meat raffle's off. Oh, so that was it, the meat raffle. For the minimal cost of a large knocked-off roasting chicken, a leg of beef and a few pounds of sausages, the meat raffle was born. Oh, maybe 15 years ago now, reviving an old neighbourhood tradition. But it truly was a pain in the arse. There were always problems with getting hold of the meat for a start. Butchers weren't quite so easy to knock off these days, and supermarket security staff were getting so much better at tracing the progress of a joint of beef through their shop under a dodgy bloke's coat. Paul, the least aggressive of the two men struggling to fit their beer bellies in behind the corner table at the Dog and Calculator, hated the meat raffle. He hated it passionately. Why wouldn't he? He was a middle-class man who bought his meat hygienically packed and reasonably priced at Waitrose, of course. His sausages were sustainably produced, organic, herb-infused and delicious. Paul simply couldn't see the appeal of grabbing a joint from the back of a lorry, sweating to carry it round the same 4 low-life pubs, obtaining money with menaces and filling in a pain-in-the-arse raffle sheet. 5 hours later, when the meat had been warmed and held and poked and prodded, it probably would be won by someone who'd cremate it or boil it to mush anyway. The culinary skills of this lot were abysmal. He'd seen enough hot dinners laid out uneaten on the tables of Joe's clients to know the truth of that. "Don't give me that look," said Joe. Paul knew why. The meat raffle was a steady money spinner that put Joe in touch with his roots. What look? It wasn't just the raffle that Paul hated. It was the principle behind it. He'd never enjoyed either the prospect or the practicalities of handling stolen goods. It made him decidedly uneasy. In any battle between police and criminals, he'd naturally side with law and order. It was just how it was. And it was just unfortunate that his family circumstances meant he ended up working for Joe Minshall, his wheeler-dealer cousin. Paul was accepted as the toff, but he never fitted in, not really. He'd adapted to the work and the life, though the process had been pained at times. He often felt lost and more than a bit confused in Joe's version of the criminal underworld. Half the time he didn't understand what Joe was asking him to do, and it was only good fortune and his undoubted charm that had stopped him getting into trouble. He certainly stood out in the seedy pubs he now frequented every day of his deeply unsatisfying life. Joe's face darkened and he rubbed his hands together. Paul knew that until that last call on his mobile, he'd been excited at the prospect of tonight's Money with Menaces trip. Paul had watched him many a time, strolling up to tables, beefy and bald-headed, and giving the drinkers his pretend friendly face. Of course, the punters bought tickets out of fear. Nobody cared about winning the meat, and Paul knew that Joe was just fine with that. This was a money spinner that was promoted as a fundraiser, but that was true only if the recipient charity was the Joe Minshall Pub Fund. But this time there was a problem. "What's happened?" asked Paul. "Some bastard nicked the meat." "Scumbags." Paul smiled. Now this was interesting. Archie and Dan must have done what Paul had paid them to. They'd ransacked Joe's lock-up, crammed with meat, laptops, and a bit of antique furniture, just as he asked. Paul would go to them for favours again. He couldn't have a meat raffle without any meat. Stage 1 of Paul's takeover of the family firm had been completed, and pretty successfully, though there was a way to go yet. Paul looked at his despised cousin Joe's enormous paunch, heaving with anger, and knew he'd bring him to justice sooner or later, but he had no qualms about the morality of stealing already stolen goods, and might as well make the most of it in the meantime. Meat was one thing. Yuck, that would go in the bin. But the laptops, he could make good on those. After all, there was no point in being the right-hand man of a wheeler-dealer if you didn't make the most of your position with a little bit of nicking off the back of a lorry.